I don't think you give a damn about me.
Come on, baby.
No, not that. I know you like that.
Larry Kent has been called Canada's most underrated film director. Back in the 1960s, he pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior on the screen. He made films that broke the rules.
I was not a film board guy. I was not a CBC guy. I was not an establishment guy. So the films I made really were much more, you know, independent.
Director David Cronenberg.
The first thing that struck me about Larry Kent's films is that they existed. That was incredibly important. In those days, there was really not what you would call a film industry in Canada. And movies just seemed not to exist unless they came out of the National Film Board, and then they were sort of docudramas. And Larry's stuff, these were real movies. I saw Sweet Substitute at an actual movie house where I had to pay to see his movie. And that was fantastic. That was an incredible revelation. I mean, it was like a real movie made by a Canadian, low budget. I related to everybody in it. I said, what is this? This is great. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? And how did he get these movies made and shown?
Kent's films have been banned in several provinces because of their frank and stylized depiction of sex and drug use. That gave him the reputation of being a provocateur and made him a counterculture favorite. Film critic Jason Anderson.
Larry Kent's films were very sharply realistic, and also improvised too. And so people are really sort of drawing from their own lives and people they know. And there's explicit, not explicit sex, but there's still, you know, proper sex scenes. Sort of very modern sex scenes in his movies. And also harsh language, things that just weren't really appearing in films at the time. And it's a very sort of socially conservative era, so for this stuff to actually appear at all was quite revolutionary. And he paid for it too, because these films subsequently got banned by most film boards in Canada, and were sort of limited to some university campus exposure, some festival exposure, but otherwise they weren't disseminated very widely.
Kent's films are a staple in the courses taught by David Douglas, a film professor at Montreal's Concordia University.
The initial films themselves came out of the era of the late 1950s. They were an era of change that had not yet happened. People were bored with the 1950s. They were expecting change, but they didn't know what form that change would take. And through, from Bitter Ash, his first film in 1963, through his films by the end of the decade, we see the arc of that change.
Well, it was the 60s, and of course the early 70s, which were still the 60s. And Larry's movies were about things that we were interested in: sex, politics, society, all of those things interlinked. The frustrations of being young, as well as the exuberance of it, drugs, of course. And he was talking about all of those things, and he was talking about them in a Canadian setting, which made them even more relevant and more striking.
Yes, you do your part down at the office, because you're paid for it. Big, brave hunter goes out and brings home the meat. Well, I don't.
His politics were not just sort of against the war type politics, but they were also an anticipation of feminist politics.
You know that, don't you? You have observed that over the years.
Many people have said that I was the first feminist filmmaker.
I was not hired.
Look.
I came here of my own free will.
The critics were not willing to accept the idea of a woman wanting more than the life assigned to her.
The eggs were cold.
I called you when they were hot.
We could have left them in the pan.
You don't like them hard.
My, you're in a great humor this morning.
You're a wonderful inspiration.
I'm strongly opposed to the whole idea of storyboards. The reason is that the storyboard, you put the actor in the frame, and therefore you become very much stultified. That is, you've got a beautiful frame, but the acting is kind of stiff and has to live in that. But I believe that if you